we're going to talk about agriculture and the way that we think it should be, or improvements that we would make. And we're going to start out by going into our utopian vision of agriculture. And obviously, it's exactly what it says. It's utopian. It probably wouldn't work in real life, but everybody has their own view of that. But we're pretty connected to ag, and we know a little bit about it. So we're going to give our real world view of ag and something that would probably work in real life that would be an improvement. One of the things, I guess, that I want to, maybe both of us can clarify, and maybe it's different for you, Katherine, than it is for me, is like, what is the purpose of improving the ag? Like, and I know it's not just one thing, but is it for environmental improvement or for human health?
Right.
Or for any number of things? And I don't know what agriculture and use with it. What is the thing that you really want to fix? Like, what's the goal
Yeah,
with it?
that's
Is it
a really
environmental
good
or is it human
question.
health, or which one takes priority?
Yeah, because maybe just starting out, we kind of need to like, what is the purpose? Like, if we're going to improve for what? And I would say all of the above, right? I mean,
Yeah.
shouldn't we don't want agriculture to continue to harm the environment, right? And we want it
Mm-hmm.
to be good for
Yeah.
human health. So as far as even like if you're talking about like pesticides and things like that, but also like nutrition wise, being people being able to get enough
Mm-hmm.
vegetables and things like that. And so yeah, those would be probably two of the main things, right, that we're trying to improve to that, being kind of the
What I'm thinking.
yeah, the parameters, yeah.
Yeah. And that's, to me, that's what I think. And I think the environmental and the health aspect is very intertwined, because
Yeah.
nutritionally, that's straight up for the human health, because the rest of the environment doesn't care if we're healthy or fully nourished or not. But
Right.
as far as our waterways and air quality and a lot of other things, and I can get into some more what I think that it is affecting, what ag is affecting now, when I give my side of it. But one of my big things is, and this goes into the environmental part, but it's just the aesthetic of what things could be. I think if agriculture was maybe done differently,
Right.
uh, agriculture is not always pretty. And one thing I guess we should point out before we go into this is, I don't know what your view is. We neither one of us have
Yeah.
said yet, but yours is probably going to look way different because you're vegan and I'm not. And
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
the meat production side of ag is something I think about a lot, even though I
Right.
haven't been very involved in that. I've done more gardening than I have
Right.
raising
And when
meat,
I
but I
and when
have
I
done meat.
me coming from a vegan perspective, I have to think about other things like, okay, well then what are you going to use for fertilizers and things like that? That opens up a whole different thing
Yeah.
on my end too. Yeah. What's your utopian
So
view?
my utopia is somewhere maybe a cross between. I don't know how ag was done in a lot of parts of the world, but I do read a lot about pre-European Americas, Native Americans, Indians, and that was not all the same. But
Right.
there's some of the accounts that I've read. I'm trying to read a book right now of some about the natives in California, and so that's the one that I guess I'm going to lean
Yeah.
towards the most. But maybe a hybrid of that and sort of the food forest type thing mixed with, say, the Joe Salatin style of meat production, and I can
Right.
sort of explain that.
Yeah.
So I just start out with saying, or trying to explain what I mean by what the natives were doing, and I'm going to use the Californians as an example because this is what I've read seemed to be the most detailed history so far. Uh, so when the Europeans came to this country or to this continent,
Yeah.
They saw abundant wildlife, as far as um, animals, mammals to eat, and also acorns and nuts and all of this. The land was overflowing with food basically, and they thought that the land was just like that and it was being ultra productive. And I think they even accused the natives of being lazy because they weren't utilizing and capitalizing off of all this abundance.
Right.
When you actually get into studying what was going on, the land was not just productive like that. It was a management system. So it was, I don't know if you could quite call it agriculture, but to me, it was a step above that. So it was like an agroforestry. I don't know what you would call it, but they were able to manipulate the environment and create just a superabundance. They made it to where the animals had forage and they eat a lot of meat, and then they even had systematic burnings and choppings of different plants. And it turns out that a lot of the things they were doing, science backs up that they were great methods. So my utopia would be something similar to where they were managing the wild forest and the ecosystem that they were given. They were managing that, and but mixing in other non-native plants like apples, pears, things like this. And a lot of people may not know who the Joe Salatin is. He's a farmer in Virginia, but and he did it. He didn't develop all his ideas, but he's did a real good job of teaching them and refining them. But basically, uh, using meat animals, cattle, lamb, chickens, geese, hogs, even to where they're usually detrimental to when you're grazing them on land, like they deplete the ground that they're on. He has rotational systems that actually the land gets more and more productive over time, and it's an understanding of soil biology and the biology of the grasses and the woods and so on. And I could talk forever about that, but there's methods of using meat animals to actually increase the productivity of the land. And then probably everybody that's watching this is aware of the food forest scenario, to where it's not an orchard would be a monocrop of one type of apple or one type of peach, where the food forest is mixed up with legumes and different kinds of fruit trees, and the spread of disease is not as big of a problem. And also, the fertility of the land is better because the soil needs a diversity. So, some sort of agriculture that sort of combined all of those together. And in my utopia, there wouldn't the difference in woodlands and wild places wouldn't look much different or any different from a pristine wilderness.
So my utopia would be that the agriculture would be just much more local, so that it is kind of difficult in Southeast Alaska because like I live on a really big island and there's a bunch of really big islands around us. So the size of a farm is going to be limited by, we don't have prairies or, it's forested and it's a lot of, that sort of um, geography or whatever. And so I see though, like kind of more moderate size farms and in areas where everybody's living, and then individuals maybe growing a few more of their own things, like, okay, I'm going to grow a little bit of basil, and that sort of thing. And so a little bit more supplementation of what people would be eating. But because there are different climates in, say, like let's just talk about the United States,
Mm-hmm.
some things are going to grow, like growing tomatoes here probably doesn't make sense. And so, it probably does make sense to do some amount of shipping food, here and there. But but yeah, I just kind of, my utopia, which maybe isn't much of a big reach, would be that we just have more regional, a little bit larger farms that can actually, a lot of maybe the produce in the grocery store would come from local farms and not everything shipped in from someplace else. And so that's just talking about Alaska, but just let's say someplace else like Oregon or whatever, where they would have just some medium-sized farms that the grocery stores are supposed, they don't get everything from California. That like much of what they get is from Oregon. But now, of course, there's the seasonal thing, So I don't. You're Yeah. Even in my utopia, I don't see. I suppose we could say in a utopia, we might have some enclosed spaces where we grow stuff through the winter. So we're not having to ship so much stuff, So yeah, we have some indoor growing spaces, but then what would you use those for during the winter time? I guess you could, you know, uh, grow things during the summertime in those enclosed areas, like maybe tomatoes. And so you wouldn't have to ship some of the like tomatoes from someplace else. So yeah, I that's kind of my utopia is I don't know if it's much of a utopia, but right now we don't really have much of that at all. Like it is completely um dependent on long lines of shipping to get to places.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's still kind of a utopia. And it was interesting because I was reading a book for my other series of this economic growth of the United States, and so much like 90% of people were self-sufficient. Like they might buy a stove, or whatever, or they might buy a few things like some textiles to make their own clothes. But for the most part, like most people were not in this market system. They were self-sufficient. And it's just amazing how far we are from that. And so my utopia would be that we would get a little bit more, our lines of supply of our food would get a little bit shorter. I still think like, great, get bananas from someplace else, pineapples from someplace else. I'm
Yeah.
even in my utopia, I think it's nice. It's fine. Let's do some exchange of things that grow better in different areas, but that we've just become much more self-sufficient. Yeah. In our little
Yeah.
regions. Yeah.
And that is a big deal for you, I guess, because uh, people, I don't think they realize how easy the chain can be broken, and even in my part of the country, but where you're at, uh,
Yeah.
could
Yeah, you
happen
and
if
I
you
have
guys
talked
got.
about our like the differences, the long chains of supply for
Yeah,
me, but even you, like, right? Do you guys get some stuff from California or even Florida and things like that, right? In your grocery
yeah,
stores in
and that's
Arkansas.
going. I guess that would go into the real world part of it for me is so. Yeah, you're in a completely different climate, and obviously it is all going to look completely different
Yeah,
climate and just the isolation part of the island. It's a you're very dependent on outside inputs, but even here where most of the stuff that I can go into the grocery store and look at that I say I'm going to buy, uh, a lot of that, maybe 75% of it can be grown locally, and yet it's
right.
stamped California or
Yes.
Mexico or whatever. And that that doesn't make sense to me. And I think there is real world possibility of that changing. I think it should change, and I think that farmers could be profitable uh, here in the. I'm going to go ahead and say that where I'm at, I'm in the Delta region of the Mississippi River, and so it's a big farming region, but it almost connects into the Midwest, which is where most of the row crops are grown. So
Right.
the U.S., I guess it would break down that California is growing most of the bell peppers, food crops, the stuff that we'll see in our grocery aisle, but then the grain that's
Yeah.
either used for bread or for meat production.
Right.
It's grown in the Midwest. And so I think that could be changed a lot. And that is something that I would like to see changed. In the real world, I think it's very doable, and I think it should be done.
So yeah, so what is in the real world, what is kind of more your realistic view of kind of where we should be as far as agriculture?
What I would like to see, there's a few things, and I can break it down. And as I mentioned a while ago, just a second ago, the row cropping region, which I'm in, so they stick to just a few species. They have rice, corn, soybeans, and cotton was what you would see in the South. And uh, rice is not even that widespread, and I can go into that in a little bit. But for the normal row crops, the corn and soybeans, and that's what you'll see a lot of in the Midwest and the Plains area and all of that. There's a few things about that I feel like should be different. For one, all of that corn and soybeans that's being grown, the majority of it is not for human consumption. It's for animal consumption. And so I feel like, first off, if meat production was changed to where at least the beef and, well, what do we eat in this country? We eat pork, beef, and chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Realistically, that's what
Right.
we eat. So just look at the beef by itself. This can be a huge debate and people get really offended, and I'm no expert, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of beef could easily be done on pasture. And it would be a complex thing, and there's a lot more conversation that I want to get into on here, but I've never done these things, but I have read about people who are doing rotational grazing, and they're also doing row cropping. But the reason I mention this is to take the cattle out of the picture, out of using the corn. You could free up a lot of this row crop land, and I don't like seeing so many acres and two species of things. And corn is really demanding of the land. It takes a lot. So that's one thing, is take as much as we could out of feedlots, out of factory farms, to where all this grain is going. Now, even if pastured poultry was a thing and people were willing to pay for it, going to the chickens, if pastured poultry was something that people were willing to pay for, it still wouldn't free up that much grain production, because they need grain to build body mass and muscle, whereas the cows are ruminants and they can live entirely off of grass and pasture like that. So I would like to see as much of the row crop land taken out of those two primary crops as possible. And, I would like to see us as a country, or a world even, work away from factory farms in general, just because I don't think it's that humane. And the feedlots with the cattle may be the worst ones that I see. And I think that would be the most realistic to break away from. And I'm not talking about overnight, but over a generation. I think it could happen if the drive was there. And with some education, that people could actually make their land more productive if they did this right. And there are few people doing it in this country and in other countries, and they've proven it, but it's just so hard to persuade the majority of farmers to change their style. So that's part of it. And as far as the fruits and vegetables, I don't understand. I'm sure there's some reasoning behind it that makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot of things that we could grow here in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, name any of the southern states that are growing a lot. And even the Midwest could be growing their own tomatoes, peppers, not year round. We expect this stuff year round. So yeah, but I would like to see as many of those crops taken out of California, and this is not a stab at California, they need the crops taken out of there. They're running out of water. They're
Yeah.
using every drop of water they got to raise crops for the other 49 states, and it just doesn't make sense. And I would like to see that change. It would help us. We would have a more secure food chain, and they would cut down on transportation and those sort of things, and help the West out. They've beat California to death. They've dried it up, and there's so many people there that they need all the relief they can get, and I think we could give that to them, and it would be an improvement to us. And fruits especially. There's some fruits that we're shipping in from California. Persimmons is the ones that comes first to mind. You can grow those things here practically pest free. They're just abundant and they're pest free. I'm sure if it was a huge industry, there would be some stuff arise, but there's no need that we're shipping things like that can grow so maintenance free in this side of the country. There's no reason to be shipping it from California, and again,
Right.
free up some of their water in their land.
Yeah.
So I'll stop with that for now, but there's a ton more I could add to that.
Yeah. So my thinking of kind of a realistic change would just simply be that, okay, because I think realistically, just not farming's kind of hard. And I think that a lot of people just don't really want to do it. So to be realistic that, that all these different regions are going to, I mean, are going to have little local farms. I don't know that that's really realistic. I look at Southeast Alaska and some of the different farms that have popped up and have sustained themselves and are still in business and still going. And so I kind of see that some people will be interested and some people will love it enough to kind of keep at it. And so I think maybe it's realistic to think that maybe we can grow those kind of local, smaller farms. But I just think that we're just going to be dependent on some areas a little bit more than others. And I agree with you. If we can just diversify the regions a little bit more would be
Mm-hmm.
nice. And so that some of these, you know, maybe some of these really big farms can improve their practices, like you're saying, like let's move away from this factory farming stuff. Like I would like us to get away from it. And I don't animal agriculture. Why do we depend on, animals to eat? And, let's just eat the grains ourselves and the legumes ourselves. And so just by doing that, but then you have a lot of other problems. What about the dislocation of farmers then? Because the fact of the matter is, if, a certain number of people, because people are going to eat less of it. So you're just going to you're going to be producing less of those things in that scenario. So what are all these farmers going to do then? Now, some of them can switch over to doing some more fruits and vegetables, and we're still going to need some larger farms to do some of the grains and legumes and things like that. But yeah, I would just say larger farms improving their practices, and maybe instead of some of these mega farms, like you have what used to be kind of larger family farms everywhere, that kind of the land got bought out, and now you've got these big organizations running these things. And I think it's reasonable to think that we can at least go back to some smaller farms owned and run by more people. And of course, my utopia would be that we're growing stuff just for, just plants for humans to eat, so we don't have to deal with the whole animal thing. But you do have to deal with the animal thing, and that there's still wild animals, and how do you manage those in your systems? And so, yeah, and just, a little bit of improvement. I do see individuals being kind of interested in growing like their own little bit of basil or a little bit of rosemary and things like that. And so maybe we can kind of just ratchet that up a little bit. But I do think that we're probably always going to rely a little bit on a little bit larger farms in certain areas. And yeah, just improving the practices over time. And I think that if we do those changes slowly over time and not get in a situation where it's like so bad that we put in these regulations that just like hurt everybody so suddenly, if we could, I don't know that humans have the foresight to be able to make those planned changes, but
Yeah.
it'd be nice if we could do it slowly over time so that it's not going to hurt any group of people really bad right off as we kind of make those changes or whatever.
To the point that you're making, and I guess the point that should make to everybody out there is the conversation we're having is as things are. So without a huge cultural shift,
Right.
people do eat meat and people do eat the same basic things. And I'm not sure how much the general public, they like the idea of organic, but when it comes to spending more money on these crops for local farmers and these sort of things,
Yeah.
culturally we're not there, and that's not what this conversation's about. And that's why
Yeah.
both of us are sort of restricted on what huge changes we think could be made. And that's, I think that's important to put out there, and that's kind of why me and you are going the direction we are with it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I forgot to mention that I do think could be implemented, and I think it would benefit farmers a lot, and I think after they did it for a year or two, they would latch onto it. And I myself haven't done this very much, but I don't know if people here have heard of another author called Gabe Brown.
Yes.
But he's been farming for years, and he was a conventional farmer. He used the herbicides in the whole 9 yards and tilled his land and was growing row crops in, I think, North Dakota, maybe a South Dakota, regardless. And he's incorporated these multi-species cover crops into a row crops scenario. So I realize that row crops are not going anywhere. We're still
Right.
going to be the axis of our food system is corn and soy, and it's going to be for until some huge cultural shift happens. But even with that, I think that's where one of the biggest environmental impacts could be made. There's so much that's happening with these multi-species cover crops, and for anybody that don't know, he's growing row crops, monoculture things like corn and soy and wheat, but he's undersowing them with a mixture of up to 8-10 species of cover under there, and it'll be clover and brassicas and I don't know what all. It's a lot of things, and it would obviously be regional, and it would be a big learning curve. But what he's achieving here is, after so many years of weaning off of the chemicals and weaning off of the tillage, he's been able to basically get away from chemical fertilization. If what he's saying is true, and I personally believe it, he's not adding any fertilizer, be it organic or not. Now, he will, I think, take a field out of production and it's growing only covers for a season.
Right.
But he also raises meat animals, and so he's still getting protein harvested off of that land. He's growing out beef primarily and chicken, I think. So he's doing that. The erosion is obviously way better. And one of the big things when we just talk about environmental problems, I don't realize the general public is aware of what a contributor big ag is. So right now it's a political thing, but CO2 emissions from vehicles and all of this. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to get into that. Whether or not that's causing us to heat up or what, you can decide for yourself. But if the way that we farm, when we till, that's where about some calculations have it at 25% of the extra CO2 that's out there. So a quarter of all of the CO2 is actually from tilling the soil and releasing the carbon. And when the carbon comes out, it's binding with O2, and the carbon is out of the soil where it should be, and it's going up into the atmosphere. And so that's a thing. But even if let's just say that you're not into the whole human caused global warming or whatever and the CO2, everybody, I think, can agree that water is a problem. Water, whether it's too much water or not enough water, is catastrophic. You have
Yeah.
droughts in California, you have floods in the Midwest. So, this is all hydrology. And farming the way that Gabe Brown's doing it with the cover crops and without the tillage, I think could mitigate a lot of that. For one, there's a lot more carbon in the soil and there's a lot more soil life, and that drastically alters the water table. It allows water to seep into the ground. Soil doesn't soak in the water, it's the microorganisms and things that are in there, and the carbon, they're dependent on the carbon in there. So, uh, if you're in an arid area, you want to retain as much of that moisture as possible. If you're in a wet area, you still want to retain as much of that as possible in the ground so that it's not running off and causing flood problems. And uh, I'm living here in Arkansas, and we irrigate like you've never seen irrigation like this. We flood irrigate fields. It's the most water I've ever seen used, and it's groundwater, and it's a limited resource.
Yeah.
The farmers here are starting to face that challenge, but they're still using it like no tomorrow. Their business model is dependent on it. I think that could be hugely alleviated using Gabe Brown's system. And there's an argument that'll always be thrown at me when I mention this, and I think I can counteract that with the argument that Gabe Brown has with uh, the overall thinking or rationale behind his style of farming is if they don't irrigate, they flood irrigate the way they do, they're not going to get these ridiculous yields, because they do. Here they have ridiculous yields per acre with the corn and soy, and I've been here 11 years and I've never seen it fail, and that's dependent on the water, no doubt. So let's say that they get slightly lower yields. I'm not going to try to put a percentage on it, but it costs the farmers an enormous amount of electricity or diesel to pump this out of the ground. A lot of times they relift it from the natural water sources, but a lot of it's coming from the ground that costs a lot of resources. And I've told by one of my friends here locally that a farmer said for every rain that they get and they don't have to irrigate, that's $10,000 in their pocket for one watering of a corn.
Right.
Probably a 1,500, 2,000 acres seems to be what some of the farmers are. Some of them are much larger. 1,000 acres is smaller side of the farm. But if you were to, I'm going to go a step further with it. If you were to convert 1% of the 1% of the row crop land in my county alone, so one out of every 100 acres was swapped over into this growing style, it'd still be growing monoculture row crops.
Yeah.
The water impact would be huge, but what would also be huge is wild game. So that's even if you're vegan and you're just looking at the environmental
Right.
aspect, the wildlife are going to be better off. And I promise you, the farmers that had that 1 acre out of every 100 converted over, that would be like a gold mine for them, because hunting, sports, uh, game hunting, I'm trying to think of the words here, is a huge
Right.
income for these farmers here. All of these farmers are at least in at least some part of their land, or they're using it for their own, they're using it for their self, one way or the other. But hunting is very tied in with all of this, and you're looking at just ridiculously feeding the game and bringing them in. I think it would be crazy.
So you're talking about Gabe Brown. I watch Geiger Farm. He's in my subscriptions if anybody want to take a look at his channel. So he's doing that same thing. There's not a lot of inputs going into his farm. He has cattle. He does grow the row crops. He also grows other things like, organic seed and things like that, for planting and. So yeah. So if you're looking at okay, that would be more the ideal. And if we could get that, more people doing that. And I know that he's involved in teaching other farmers to grow like that. And so, yeah, if we're just looking at how to make what we've got going on right now better, looking at those types of folks doing it that way. But I think about it, and, um, you know, it takes somebody really kind of, really dedicated and smart to really work at those things. That you can't just do the thing and then throw the pesticides on, and you're, throw a bunch of water on and you're going to get a crop. It's like it's a real skill. And so
Yeah.
it takes, and I don't know, I remember doing a little research, and it was a whatever really tiny percentage of farmers who were doing organic, row crops. And so, like, I don't know if that percentage has grown, but yeah, that needs. And so are there the people going to be willing to um make that sort of commitment and make that transition, which has got to be, isn't too easy either. So,
And I'm pretty sure that's why it hasn't happened.
and
And
and like you had said earlier, are people willing to pay the higher prices for those things? And so, um I think that that's got to be a little bit more of a mindset, of, I'm going to do a little bit less spending my money on this and spend a little bit more money on food, because higher prices on food, as long as it's not, a company just taking a big cut out of it, if it's really the price
yeah,
going to the farmer, then they're making more money. And so, like, I think the mindset of the public, needs to be more, we want, I'm going to spend a little bit more money on food because I want to get this to the farmer. It's good for them. So I don't know.
and I do agree with that, but I actually think, and I could be bad mistaken on this because I'm not an economist and I'm not a row cropper, but I think that where the farmer would get more income from the Gabe Brown style of farming, I think the finished product wouldn't be that much more expensive to the public,
Right.
but Monsanto and wouldn't be getting a huge cut of it because that's the
Yep.
thing, the big chemical companies, and that's something that I would like to take money and power out of the chemical companies' hands. But I,
Yeah, and so I don't want
I
to interrupt you, but that just makes me
yeah,
think that, like, for an individual person buying something, a little bump in price, is going to cost them a little bit more, for their food.
yeah,
But for a farmer, having a little bit higher price for organic on all
it's
the
huge.
stuff they're selling is a big deal. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's huge, and like I said, and they're cutting out a lot of the middleman cost with the chemicals and with the irrigation. Now, Gabe Brown doesn't irrigate. A lot of the country, a lot of the Midwest don't do that. They really can't do it effectively. They have contoured land. Here it's just flat, and
Right.
we actually have precision. We have precision level fields that are thousands of acres. So
Yeah, and that's
it,
the other thing too. Like, there's a couple things there, because I know, uh Geiger Farm, they don't irrigate, right? So they're like depending on, are we going to get a rain or not, and when they plant and that sort of thing. And so you have to be smarter, or in some ways luckier sometimes, about how it
yeah,
goes. But you have to be really careful about what you plant and when you plant, depending on how much rain you typically get, and then sometimes you don't. And so that's another real skill.
where
But
is
also growing things in areas that they're meant to grow, so that, like, if you're trying to grow grapes in Washington State or something, it's probably not going to go as well as it may be down in California. And so maybe you shouldn't be
yes,
growing grapes in Oregon or something
yeah,
like that. So I think growing,
yeah,
not trying to use outside resources to force a crop that really probably shouldn't grow there naturally under the conditions, is another thing to think about too. And then it also made me think, as you're talking, that, the more we do have local stuff, the more people know what that farmer's going through to get that to you, makes you be willing to say, oh, I'm going to spend a little bit more money. So the more we have separated out the regions, that we've got urban communities that have no idea how food is grown, and they just want to look at something that's least expensive, the more you
yeah,
get agriculture close to peep community, it's more that are that's intermixed, the more people
Mhm.
realize, the value of it, and maybe the more reason why they would want to spend a little bit more. And so that's just getting regional farms into regions um, would help that kind of you know that ability for farmers to make more money, yeah, anyway,
Yeah,
because it's like, how
I
do you
think so.
communicate this to people? How do you get people to know that it's important to get farmers a little bit more money? And just having farmers around you would help that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. To the point that you're talking uh, about public perception and wanting to be willing to pay a little bit more for their food. Something that I want to point out is uh, the current way that the farmers are making money, the big row croppers. And I still want to preface this by saying I'm not an agroeconomist or anything like that, but I do know that farmers are heavily subsidized and incentivized to get higher and higher yields. And that on its face makes sense because, we don't have enough food to feed the world and all of this. That's a conversation of its own. I do want us to see us be very productive, but at the same time, uh, people are incentivized to get these high yields, which is incentivizing them to use the chemicals and keep these huge chemical companies alive. So, where I'm getting at this, if the farmers were putting in this amount of money and for the price that they're selling these commodity crops, they would go broke. However, there's farmers here that are wealthy, very wealthy people. They make a good living. They do work their ass off. They're hardworking people and they're very intelligent, ingenuitive people. I can't take anything away from these farmers, but their livelihood is based on a subsidized commodity crop system. So that is something that could realistically change. Well, I say realistically, so the federal government could subsidize the other style of farming to where that they could break even, or
Right.
if they didn't subsidize the current model as much as they do, it would make the other farmers more competitive because on an
Yes.
even playing field, uh, this style of farming probably wouldn't be competitive.
Right. Yeah.
They're producing, like I said, they want more and more production, but some of the drive behind that is to increase grain production to the point that it shoves the price down. And
Right.
the people who are exporting these grains and things like that, they're the ones that are getting filthy rich. Now, like I said, they are farmers that are doing very well. There's some wealthy farmers around here, millionaires.
Right.
Uh, it's sort of it's a rant of mine, but
Yeah.
uh, the government's subsidizing these things, so they're sort of promoting the use of chemicals and keeping these huge chemical companies propped up. And I don't think that's an accident because I think that these chemical companies, which incidentally are typically tied in with huge pharmaceutical companies,
Right.
I don't know if people are aware of that, but Bayer owns what used to be Monsanto,
Right.
and there's several cases like that. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations, and to think that they're very separated from our elected officials and federal government is
Right.
probably
Yeah,
not
once you
very
get so big
realistic.
and you can contribute a lot of money, then
Yeah,
people pay attention. For
yeah,
sure. That's
you
gonna
got
that's
the
gonna
upper hand.
contribute to decision making for sure politically. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I won't get too political here, but uh, there is policy change that would benefit the American people and the American would incentivize the American farmer to change their practices.
Right.
But I don't know that will ever happen. That's as old as history. There's money in the power in the money sort of
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
and call it a conspiracy. But uh,
Yeah, no, and also that's the other thing too, that when people are so separated from where they're and how their food is grown, they aren't educated enough to be able to say, I'm going to vote for this person because this person is going to make these policies that improve our farming or whatever. So it's like,
and it probably wouldn't matter with
yeah,
the choices that they have anyway at this
right,
point, regardless of party. But on a realistic note, uh, going back to the utopian thing and what I was talking about with, say, the way that things were happening pre-European in this
right,
continent, or the thing that you're talking about with localized farms, which mine would also tie into very localized. There is food security in this large system, but it's so we should appreciate that because I read history. You do. You read a lot of history. Native Americans had big famines.
right.
When the Europeans came in, there were famines. There have been widespread famines on this continent up until recent history.
Right.
And now most of the famines that are happening in developed countries are due to wars and things like that rather than huge crop failures.
Yeah.
So I think rather than condemning what we have now for
Yeah.
agriculture, we should look at it as a huge advancement and now
Yes.
figure out how to incorporate this back into
Yeah.
something a little more wholesome and healthy.
Yeah, you're
So,
absolutely right about that. That if we were to become dependent on just our small regions, then if you do
mhm,
have a failure and you don't have your supply lines set to other places where you're used to getting some supplies in from someplace else, then you're that's not good. So we do want to have some interconnectedness. Yeah, and so there have been improvements. And I think talking about improvements, I mean, just within my lifetime, I've seen, a lot of these small farms pop up and then they're selling at farmers markets and they're selling to the local grocery stores. So that's been, in the last number of decades, that's been a big change. I don't know where
yes.
that's at, if that's staying on the same level or if that's gotten bigger or if it's dropped off. I haven't looked into that, but it is still kind of ongoing. So
Yeah.
it is a direction that maybe we are kind of going in that direction.
And my opinion is because I've tried to observe this and it's so hard to wrap my head around it, but are the small farms getting bigger? Or are they getting smaller? Because I've seen
Right.
a lot of small farms collapse and
Yeah.
I've seen some thrive. And
Yeah.
so something that's happened very COVID related is at first everybody got interested in local because the food supply chains slowed down a little. They didn't
Yeah.
crumble, but people were afraid that they might.
Yeah.
And so that caused a lot of interest. But at the same time, some of the labor shortages and stuff associated with the lockdowns and whatnot. I don't know what all caused it. Again, keep the politics out of it, and I have no idea. But inflation has blown up to the point that uh, I'm buying less of the wholesome food. Or at least being a little more mindful of what I buy because
Yeah.
inflation has damn near doubled the price of food here. I think just going to
Right.
the grocery store and buying vegetables and things.
Yeah.
So this stuff, there's no constants in food supply. There's no constants in agriculture, and we got to be realistic about that. But also to the point of, like saying the advantages of modern agriculture is that we have this food security, but I think that we've gotten so big and interdependent that we are also setting ourselves up for failure as
Yeah.
well. So because we're dependent on corn and soybeans and free species of meat.
Yeah.
And like you said, even
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. It's very not diversified at
it's not
all, and so
diversified.
if something hits the corn, whether it's a some sort of pest or if it's some sort of climate thing that happens to a big region, climate event or something like a drought or whatever, then you're SOL. Right. Yeah.
It could be that, or it could be that we're so dependent upon chemical fertilizers
Right.
and the herbicide. If there's, and I don't think it's that unrealistic to have something kibosh. A war in the right place could
Right.
probably cut us off from our phosphates or something like that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
in the way things are rolling now, you have to calculate in everything that's going on in the world
Yeah.
uh, with that. And I don't know what chemicals are used, what where they get the chemicals that make the herbicide. I
Right.
don't know where they harvest the phosphates
Yeah, so
and
the
all of
more you're
this.
dependent on outside inputs from your farm, then
It could
the more you
collapse.
have to be mindful of what happens over there when you can't get
Right.
that anymore. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about a lot in my garden where, how can I get more fertility into my soil? Like, what if there's not enough seaweed out on the,
Yeah.
washed up on the beach one year or something? Like I need to think about what's coming into my place too, and that's just within a local, really local space. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just an ongoing thought process, and it's
Yeah.
constantly changing, I think. But I do want to point out, like you're still in the farming game. You're
Yep.
making it work. So you are doing it. I have actually dropped out, but while I'm sitting here saying what people should do, I'm not doing it right now, but it makes me want to learn more and experiment with these things and see what I can do.
Yeah, because
Uh,
that's a question I had. It's like, what should individuals
yeah,
do? So it might be just that a consumer might look for an organic or an organic product, or they might look for a more local product to support their local farmers, and so that's one thing. Or another individual could, you do a lot of like mushroom hunting, and you do a lot of gleaning, and that sort of
hmm
thing. And so that's what people can do. And then, some people can grow things. And so I think that like that's another question, is that what can we all do to actually, you know, change things to actually get to
yeah,
a little bit more utopian vision of
yeah.
agriculture.
And I just want to point it out just for the fact of somebody saying, well, you're talking about it, but you're not doing it. You actually are. You are producing food locally, and you're actually producing a lot of your fertility
Right.
locally. So hats off to you. But there's there's some people doing it, but it's hard. It's not easy, and uh, you have certain restrictions of public perception of what people are willing to buy, and it could be way different in my part of the country as for you. And so make sure that I'm not finger pointing or whatever, and make sure that I am putting it out there that I haven't tried all of these things. It's just things that I've read about. I have tried some of them though, and that's why I do stand behind some things more than others.
Right.
And uh,
But I think that that's the thing. Like we're kind of this, just an example of where things are at is, I've seen some little farms that didn't make it, and somebody's decided to do something different for whatever reason, or somebody may have been selling stuff and they've gone more to, um, you know, just uh, just growing their own food for their family, and sort of things like that. And so like I don't have an idea really just of where that small farm is going. It almost seems like it's going down, but maybe that's just my perception in my area with
maybe
the people I'm around.
it's a bumpy graph, I would think, but I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, maybe there's just some dips, and
Yeah.
maybe it's going to slowly go up. I don't know. Yeah.
I think the one thing that could stabilize that or cause it to go up is just education and people. There's some pioneers out there, people that me and you follow that are doing crazy stuff, wacky stuff, and it's
Right.
actually working, and it's things that are doable. Like the farmer can make these things happen.
Yeah.
So, the education gets out there, and uh,
And
Yep.
there I think there is definitely some government support. You're talking about, subsidies for some of these big farms and stuff like that. But there is through USDA a lot of help for the small farms too. Like I've just seen
Yep.
this as far as like our little Southeast Alaska conferences. They're putting funding in us be able to get together and learn from each other, and like the high tunnel system, getting high tunnels for people, and things like that. So there is stuff like that. So maybe if it could be, I know just within the last few years, the state of Alaska was able to get some money to get more self-sufficient, for people to be more self-sufficient as far as agriculture. And there were some grants, and it was for individuals, not for farm businesses,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
so
So
there's a little bit of that. So if we think about this as a big community of what do we want, and we want to improve our agriculture in this country, we're going to pool some of our money, and some of that's going to go. That's what our government is us pooled together deciding what to do. And if some of
right.
that goes to improving our, food security and that sort of thing, then I think that like, that could go up a little bit. That could help
Yeah.
things.
And so, yeah, that's right. Because the USDA uh, is it's a big group. And so the NRCS, the natural, help me
Re-
say that,
yeah, I know.
uh,
So Natural
natural
Resource
resources
Conservation Service or
service.
survey
Yeah.
or
Service, I think. So I think theirs seem to be geared more towards a small farmer. And I've actually
yeah,
known people that work for them, and it's very cool some of the things that they're helping with.
yeah,
And the ARS, which is Agricultural Research Service, tend to be, and they're not all row crops. They deal with animals and different sorts of things, and they
yeah,
are small farms. Fall some far small farming research that falls under that umbrella, but ARS I think is primarily concerned with huge big agriculture,
right.
and I'm not against that because
Yeah.
uh,
No, as
there's
long as we're in this system, we need to be
we
helping
have to figure
different
it out.
groups, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
and yeah, so and I've been exposed to some of that, and they have done some. They're responsible for some big innovations, and I honestly I think if enough farmers in an area say they've went towards the Gabe Brown method of row cropping, and they could prove their yields and the dependability of that system, and sort of be able to show 10 years of constant uh, profit that an ARS facility might pick up
Right.
and and dedicate part of their research to that and publish some papers on it and put it in the literature, and then over time the extension agents maybe could go out, because
Right.
right now as far as I know, if you were a row cropper around here and you saw what Gabe Brown was doing, you couldn't just go to get an extension agent and say, "Hey, man, I want to do this. Can you show me how to do
Right.
it?" I doubt that's a thing. And if they got Gabe Brown or his son and them to consult with, it would cost them a lot of money. And
Right.
Gabe Brown's honest about this. He's making way more money with consulting than he is with his farming operation. So
Right.
uh, again, going back to education, solve a lot of problems with that, and uh, it takes a few people doing something, whatever that thing is, for other people to look at them. It's really not going to be helpful if the government says we think you should do this,
Right.
or we're just going to flat out pass regulations to
Right.
force you into it.
Right.
You need to see somebody else say, "Oh, look at they're doing it.
Right.
They're as smart as I am. If they can do it, I can do it."
Right.
And look at their profit margins.
Yeah.
It's working for them. I will try that, and then they'll seek out the advice that they need to do that.
Right. Yeah. So those are some of our ideas about what we think about what would be a utopia for agriculture, and some more realistic ideas about how we might get there. We would be interested in hearing what any of you guys have to think about how agriculture should look, especially from some of you folks that are doing farming on a little bit bigger scale. That would be interesting to hear. So anyway, we'll see you guys later.